What causes anorexia nervosa and avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, or ARFID? Psychiatric disorders like anorexia and ARFID are caused by a combination of factors, including social stressors, psychological development, and a person's unique biology. Certain behaviors that trigger restrictive eating, like dieting, are very common, yet only a few percent of people who diet go on to develop a disorder. Why are some individuals more susceptible to developing restriction? Genetics may explain why certain individuals are more likely to develop restriction. Several studies have found that restrictive eating is more likely to run in families, and large genetic studies estimate that the risk of developing anorexia is 50 to 70% genetic. Can genetics explain why some people develop restrictive eating and others do not? First, a little background on DNA. DNA is like a language, but with only 4 letters. DNA by itself does not do very much, but instead is mainly a source of information. DNA provides the instructions on how to make proteins. The part of DNA that makes a protein is called a gene. Proteins actually do the work of running the body. Examples of proteins include things like the hemoglobin in your red blood cells that carry oxygen, or antibodies made by your immune system to fight off infections. A change in the DNA of a gene is called a mutation. Mutations change how proteins are made. Not all mutations are damaging, but if a mutation damages a protein enough, it can increase the risk of having a disease. How do you find the mutations that actually increase the risk of developing restrictive eating, though? There are over 20,000 genes, and historically, we've only been able to look at one or a few genes at a time and see if those were more likely to be mutated in patients with a condition. Modern technology now allows for all of the genes to be sequenced and all the mutations to be identified. One method now is to sequence all the genes and find out which ones are more likely to be mutated in patients with restriction compared to a group of people who do not restrict food intake. When you do an analysis like this, what you find is a list of genes that looks like a bowl of alphabet soup. One way to make sense of this is to see if the genes have a common function. If several genes on the list have similar function, then it is very likely that that function is involved in causing a disease. When you do an analysis like this, you find that the first pathway held in common by many genes on the list is the metabolism of long-chain fatty acids. The next pathway shared in common by multiple genes on the list is involved in breaking down essential amino acids like lysine, leucine, isoleucine, and valine to be used for energy by the body. Additionally, one gene on the list is involved in carbohydrate metabolism. An additional 2 genes are involved in regulation of vitamin D, which controls the levels of calcium and phosphorus in the blood. And finally, 16 of the genes on the list are all related to B vitamins. B vitamins, like thiamine, niacin, biotin, and B12, are required for several of the same steps involved in breaking down fats, carbohydrates, and amino acids from proteins to be used for energy. To put this into perspective, let's take 100 patients with restriction. Out of those 100, 44 of them will have at least one rare, highly damaging mutation in a gene involved in fatty acid use. An additional 22 patients will have a mutation in a gene related to utilizing essential amino acids, of which 11 will have a mutation in both fatty acid and amino acid genes. An additional 2 patients will have a mutation that affects carbohydrate use, while 7 patients will have a mutation that affects vitamin D levels. Finally, 15 patients will have a mutation in a gene related to utilizing B vitamins. In total, over 75% of patients who have restrictive eating patterns have at least one mutation in a gene that affects their ability to use nutrients. So what could this mean? Patients who restrict food intake are significantly more likely to have problems utilizing nutrients from their diet. The brain intuitively knows which nutrients it cannot use for energy and may develop aversions to eating foods high in that nutrient. Some vitamin and cofactor deficiencies may be due to malnutrition, but some patients may need supplementation for things that their body cannot make. Some patients may need to adjust macronutrients in their meal plans based upon their genetic profile.